Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm off of York Road, just south of the Senator Theater. I'm here at Govans Presbyterian Church. If you are like me, you have probably whizzed by on York Road dozens of times without really noticing this really lovely gem of a building dating to 1846. If you're like me, you are probably a little bit late to a movie at the Senator, and that's why you were whizzing. But today we're going to talk about this gem of a church, and I'm thrilled that I'm going to be joined by Myra Brosius, who is a member of the congregation here and has been doing a deep dive into history of the church, and in particular how it intertwines with slavery. But before we get to that, let me start kind of back in the beginning in the 1750s. That's when a man named William Govan, he was a ship's owner and had friends in high places. One of his friends in high places was Frederick Calvert, the 6th Lord Baltimore, and Calvert gave him a grant of land here where I'm standing now. He called it Drum Castle after his family's estate in Scotland, although curiously he spelled it with a Q, and I am sure he pronounced it differently than I'm pronouncing it. But Drum Castle stayed in the Govan family only for 2 generations. He passed it to his son, and when his son died in 1807, I believe, it got carved up into developable parcels, and I'm pretty sure that's because they knew something big was about to happen with the Yorktown Turnpike, what we call York Road today. It was established then, connecting the farming rich area around York, Pennsylvania with Baltimore and our harbor. And pretty soon farmers and merchants were traveling up and down the turnpike using this area as sort of a layover place, although they didn't call it Drum Castle. They renamed it after its original owner, calling it at first Govans Town and then just Govans. By the 1830s, there were people not just traveling up and down by here, there were residents here, about 200 of them, and they had a problem, especially the ones who wanted to worship on Sundays. There was no church. Baltimore was a little bit too far away, and Towson was still a rinky-dinky little town without many options. So a number of the more prominent families pitched in and got together and built this church behind me. That was in 1844. It was called a Union church because at first it served not just the Presbyterian congregation, but also a Methodist congregation and an Episcopal congregation. But pretty soon the sort of larger Presbyterian church claimed it as its own. When it was built, the folks who built it went big. They hired the most prominent architect of the day, Robert Carey Long Jr. And if you were building a church in the 1840s, it was going to be in the Gothic Revival style, and Robert Carey Long Jr. was kind of the king of Gothic architecture. He's credited with bringing the first Gothic building to Baltimore, St. Alphonsus Church on Saratoga and Park. It's still there. And about that same time, he also was designing the Franklin Street Church, which is still at Franklin and Cathedral, both lovely churches also. This church has been going along since 1844. One major change that happened was in 1906. Some of the same families that had it built pitched in together, and they got rid of the original steeple and added the tower behind me with the clock and the bells. And I'm going to stop there, turn it over to Myra. Just have to say one more word, is that like many churches in Baltimore that were built before the Civil War, this one's history is very much intertwined with the history of slavery, and that's what she and her colleagues have been digging into. So Myra, we are all yours.
Good morning. I'm Myra Brosius, and I'm a member of this church, have been for about 20 years. And I'm currently a member of a group that has developed in the church called the Racial Justice Ministry Working Group. And we have taken it very seriously to do some of this work and have actually, in that endeavor, hired a professional named Leah Gilmore, who we're very lucky to have. She has extensive experience in this area, and she also is a jazz, blues, folk, and gospel vocalist in Baltimore who is very well known. So we've enjoyed having her. We have several committees. One of them is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which I am on. And for Truth and Reconciliation, the first part, of course, is truth, to look at the truth of our history and how we have been complicit in racism in our history. And I'm going to lift up two stories that I've learned. One is John has mentioned the Govan Howard family, and the second is Robert Galbraith, which was one of our earliest ministers. William Govan was a pioneer in the shipping industry in Baltimore and made great wealth trading wheat, probably most of it with the West Indies. And so he's complicit in a lot of ways with slavery, first being that he owned 39 slaves. He also, of course, had 810 acres of land, which he bought after he made his wealth. Through his heirs, a century later, they gifted land for this church. So the second person is Galbraith. And we know about Pastor Galbraith, who was our third minister, but really our first long-term minister. And he was here since 1853 and led us through the Civil War. And he was lifted up in a pamphlet about the turn of the century, talking about our history. And they mentioned that he administered to the slaves at Hampton. Well, what does that tell us about our history, and what does that mean? We also have learned that that can mean a lot of different things. There was a lot of different kinds of ministering to slaves. Some was very patriarchal, some of it was the intent to teach the slaves their place in the world. So we still needed to do some digging to figure out where he was coming from. And as I looked into that, very early on I learned that not only did he minister there, but Eliza Ridgely fired him within a year, and allegedly for marrying a woman with African blood. Her name was Elizabeth Love. She lived as a housekeeper with his first wife, who died, with his second wife, who died, and then at some point married. And that was the woman who we know allegedly had African blood. They decided to leave Baltimore under this scandal and go settle in Illinois, where they could live, and they ended up having 2 children. We also are doing research on our more recent history and our 20th century history, and the next part will be figuring out what does reconciliation look like? What do we do with our wealth, and how do we distribute that so that we can pay some of this back? So a lot of hard questions ahead of us.